And thank you so much for tuning in to Morning Live. We're coming to you live from the Results Operations Center this morning. And today, it's all about the number crunching. And I'm sure much a sleepless night has been had by those who are hoping that the numbers will stack up. But we'll find out whether they actually do. And as I had indicated earlier, the SABC and the CSIR, we've been in partnership for 20 years this year. It started in 1999. And what we do is look at these numbers as they come through, and the CSIR normally needs just 5 to 10% of the voting districts declared for them to actually come up with a prediction. And let me tell you, they have never been wrong in the 20 years that we've worked with them. But of course, joining me now is Ndumiso Thingo from the CSIR to look at some of these numbers, because we now do have that level of prediction that they need in order to come to a result. So thanks so much for coming through.
Thank you for having me.
Perhaps before we crunch those numbers, can we just give our viewers an indication of what exactly you do? How do you formulate these numbers to come up with these very accurate predictions?
So we always use the results of the election prior to the current one. So for this election, we're using 2014 results. We take those results, we study them, use pattern recognition to group voting districts into clusters that number about 20. So out of the 23,000 voting districts, we get about 20 clusters. And then once we have those clusters, we just take the clusters and we cast away the results. And when we start getting results in this election, we feed the early results into the model, and in each cluster, for each voting district that we get, we then project for the rest of that cluster what the result is going to be. So if there's a, say, 10% or 15% drop for a particular party in a cluster, we then say it's likely that there's going to be a 10 or 15% drop as well for the rest of the cluster. In that way, we're able to project for the rest of the uncounted voting districts what the outcome is likely to be.
So many people at this point would say, but it's early days yet. Only 10% of voting districts counted as you and I sit here right now. Yes. So what's the margin of error, and how likely is that number to change?
So from history, we know that at about 5 to 10%, we predict within a margin of error of 1 to 2% at worst. Quite often it is less than 1%, 0.5 or so, but at worst it's then between 1 and 2%.
What are the sort of factors that could actually change the picture?
Well, I think if we look at how the model performs, nothing much changes its performance when it has stabilized at a certain percentage. So from history, we know that once we get to at most about 10% or so, it stabilizes. Unless there's something big that has happened, it stabilizes and allows us to then be able to say towards the end what the numbers are going to be.
So, very interesting. We have history on our side with regards to these predictions. So, it may change marginally, but not too much from here on in. So, let's take a look at what you are predicting at the moment. And let's start with where we are at right now. 10% of voting districts, just over 10% in at this point, counted.
Correct.
And what is it looking like?
So currently, the latest numbers that we had, I just got them a few minutes ago. It's at about 11.5% of voting districts declared, and we show the ANC being the leading party, retaining its majority, followed by the DA, which will, I think, end up at about 22%. No change much for the DA from the last election. And the EFF at third place appears to be coming in at just over 9%, which is a slight increase from their previous 2014 performance.
And then, of course, the smaller parties. And I would imagine that you'd have slightly more difficulty in predicting what happens there.
So the smaller parties are slightly more challenging in the sense that the percentages that they usually get are relatively small sometimes so small that they are within that margin of error that I mentioned of 1 to 2%, and therefore it becomes a bit of a challenge to predict them. However, we have in the past predicted what smaller parties get, and we see in the end how it performs.
So let's run through those numbers in real time. What are you predicting now for, say, the top 7 at this stage?
The top 7 at this stage, we have the ANC, the DA, followed by the EFF, followed by the Freedom Front Plus, then the IFP, the ACDP, and the Good Party.
And there are a few parties that were in that top 6 or 7 that have now seemingly fallen away. You think of the NFP, you think of the UDM. So where do they figure?
So at present, I do not have the results for NFP or UDM in my list at present, but I think later on we can check exactly where they stand. But for now, in the top 7, they appear not to have made it through.
And just looking at the percentages, because I think that's going to be important in terms of seats in the National Assembly.
Correct.
As well as at the provincial legislatures, how are they stacking up in that regard?
So we are busy calculating what the seats are going to look like, and later on we'll have those numbers. But obviously the ANC will get, at present with the current predictions, the highest number of seats. The change seems to be slightly down from the previous election.
And let's do that comparison from the 2014 general election to this one. Correct. So the ANC, if we look at the ANC, they were in 2014 at the national election level, they were at 62.2%. And we're predicting?
We're predicting now close to 57%. That's
so
56.8.
So there's a drop there. The
It's
DA,
a slight drop.
as you said, they seem to be holding steady.
Correct. So in 2014, they got 22.2%, and the model predicts now that they look like they will be getting 21.8%.
Marginal drop for them as well.
Correct.
Marginal, but they seem to be holding steady at that sort of 21-22% level.
Thereabouts, yes.
And then we go to the EFF, and they polled 6.4% in the last election, the last general election. But of course, they were the one that actually surprised that there was, I think the prediction in the last election for the EFF was at 3%,
Yes.
somewhere there between 3 and 4, and they came in at 6.4.
Correct. So the EFF was not in the previous election. So as I indicated to you, that we use results from the previous election to cluster, and once we have those clusters, we then take results. So they had not been there. So our margin of error was about 2% for them at 5% of voting districts counted. So this year they appear to be, because we've got now some history, 2014 and so on and so forth, they appear to be headed for 9.3%.
And
compared to the 6% that they had previously.
And I would imagine then a party like Good, what applied to EFF in the last election would now apply to Good, where you don't have any previous data to go on. So perhaps looking at that sort of error margin with Good at this stage as well.
Yeah, so we have to be careful with maybe making any declarations at this stage. What tends to happen is that if a particular party is that is new in the election is taking largely from a specific party, there is movement, let's say, from one party to another in terms of votes, then the predictions are slightly more accurate. But if that party is taking a little bit from support from that party, it's slightly more difficult to predict their results in that way. So we'll see towards the end how the Good Party has done and where it has taken its most of its support from.
And then just perhaps in wrapping those up quickly, the Freedom Front Plus and what they garnered the last time around was, and this is the Freedom Front Plus there,
Yes.
0.9%.
Yes, it was about 1%. So we're waiting to see whether they will stay at that 3% or so. but time will tell. So they seem to have increased their support.
Certainly does seem that way. Right, Dumiso Tinga, thanks so much. And of course from the CSIR, and we will be doing quite a lot of this predicting, and this is a prediction not unlike the bones that were thrown, but a lot more scientific. We have it here this morning, and these numbers, an error margin of about 1% and 2% is what you can factor in. But with that, it's back to the studio.